Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am Sonya Norman. I'm a professor at the University of California, San Diego Department of Psychiatry, and I'm a board member at ISTSS. Thanks for joining the talk on moral distress in the workplace when personal values and the workplace collide. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is moral distress and how we think about that. Also, moral injury, kind of a lasting and extreme case of moral distress. And we'll talk about potential consequences of moral distress and moral injury, and then how we can, if we do experience moral distress, help ourselves, support our colleagues if it's happening in the workplace, and how we as leaders can support our teams and our people. We'll talk a little bit about possible intervention for sort of the extreme end of the spectrum. So to start by thinking about what is moral distress, for someone to experience moral distress, their values need to be violated in some way. And values, kind of like our thumbprint, underlie everything we do. So we may not go about our day thinking, I have a thumbprint or I have values, and yet they are key to how we see and interpret anything. So there are principles or standards of behavior, how we decide on our own behavior, how we interpret others' behaviors. And it's also our judgment for what is important in life. And they're very individual. So your values and even the people very close to you may not be completely different. So moral distress generally occurs when someone's values or morals are violated. And sometimes it's because we ourselves are in a situation where we do something that goes against our own values, or maybe we fail to do something that is consistent with our values, or we fail to stop something from happening, or we bear witness to something that is deeply transgresses our values, and we have to make sense of that. And I'll give specific examples of all these kinds of moral transgressions as we go on with this talk. So an event like that occurs, and then the person in response might feel moral distress. And that might look like an emotional reaction. It might be a cognitive reaction or a mix like guilt or shame or feelings of betrayal by a system, by a person in response to that event. And we'll talk about some of the other kind of emotional and behavioral correlates of moral distress. For many people, moral distress resolves all on its own or stays kind of at this level of distress. But for some, they might experience moral injury, and that's a more long-lasting psychological, biological, spiritual, behavioral, or social impact of that event. That is really impacts functioning, is highly distressing, and may last for even years following the event. So let's get a little bit more specific, and today we're really focused on things that might occur in the workplace. So these are still broad categories, but it might be that someone has to make a decision where any option will lead to a negative outcome. So for example, during the pandemic, some healthcare professionals, especially early on, had to make a decision of, does this person get a ventilator or not? And someone didn't get one, right? So no matter what the person decided, there would be a negative outcome for someone. It might mean going against one's values or failing to do something. We've sometimes referred to these as commission or omission, or learning about such an act. One thing we hear about a lot in stressful workplaces is going numb or feeling nothing. So again, going with the healthcare example, we heard about people who saw so much more, suffering and death during parts of the pandemic that after a while they felt like they felt nothing at all. And even though they were usually very empathetic, caring healthcare providers, and this was very morally distressing for them. What does it say about me if I can look at this room of people on ventilators and feel nothing? It could be because of betrayal by leaders or trusted others. So if an organization makes decisions that go against deeply held values, this can be very distressing. And then the person has to make very difficult decisions that, again, may feel like there's no right option. If I stay, am I kind of agreeing with things that I really don't want to agree with, that really go against my values? But if I leave, am I abandoning my coworkers, my projects, my team? So again, no answer feels like the right, easy answer. And in some cases, in some extreme cases, these decisions can affect the survival of others. Again, in the healthcare examples, certainly in war examples, in people who do some kinds of international work, where they're dealing with hunger or refugees or other kinds of cases, then literally some of these categories of events that can lead to moral distress may actually affect who survives and who doesn't, even when it's clear that not everyone can be saved. This does not mean that these situations are not difficult. So a lot of the early work on moral distress actually is with healthcare professionals. There's a lot of studies with nurses. A lot of the early work with moral injury, kind of in our scientific literature and peer-reviewed literature, is more with veterans and people who've been in war. But both of those are really changing, where in the last few years, we've seen a great expansion of moral distress and moral injury research happening across the globe and with all different populations, all different kinds of work sites. I've given talks to people who work for the State Department who are in various parts of the world dealing with very difficult conflicts and having to figure out how their own values interact with the work that they're needing to do or in a position to have to do. We have ISTSS members working with refugee populations and with healthcare workers and with others. I think we saw a big blow up in large part during the pandemic. Partly why I'm referring to those examples is because we did see so many surveys and interview studies with people who were impacted on a values-based, moral distress kind of level by the pandemic. And so some of the kind of specific situations we've seen there, but also continue to see in various parts of the world, might be around having inadequate tools or resources or training, so that not enough ventilators or someone with very general medical training and generally in a generalist kind of position asked to do this very specialized pulmonary work where they feel inadequate, they feel they don't have the skills. Abiding with policies with which one does not agree. So this is probably a very common one in the workplace in terms of that things could come down from above, whether it's an immediate supervisor or, overall in a government agency, might come down from the government level. Policies that go against personal values. And again, that leads to very difficult decision making where no answer might feel like, if I just do X, I'll feel morally comfortable. If I just walk out and say I won't put up with this, that would offer some relief, but also would create probably a whole lot of other moral distress around other parts of things that person cares about in their position. So again, no easy answers. Witnessing a great deal of suffering. If you're seeing your colleagues suffer, your patient population suffer, and maybe more death than we're prepared to. So for example, again, many healthcare providers see death as part of their work, but they might be in a situation where those numbers are much higher than usual. Often honoring one set of values feels like failing in another area. So that's part of the challenge of moral distress. Again, one example we sometimes give in our work, that's kind of a day-to-day example, but maybe you want to stay late to finish at work, to finish a project you really care about. Others are waiting for you to do your piece to be able to do their part. It's an important project. And yet you also have a school event for your child or a sporting event for your child. And so are you going to choose the parenting value because it's super important for you to be there? Are you going to choose the work value because it's super important for you to be part of this team and finish your commitment? Neither of those, each of those is going to feel right, and it's going to feel like failing in another area. Having to make a decision of saving someone else's life or preserving one's own, risking infection, risking putting oneself in a dangerous situation. Do I protect myself for my family, or do I take this risk because it could help others? Witnessing or participating in rituals around things like dying or other important things that go against values. This is how we treat our coworkers. This is how We honor people who, are in a certain situation. And when those things aren't happening, that can be morally distressing. And certainly as supervisors, we can feel a lot of moral distress about having to make decisions that put some people in difficult situations, or about um, having to support organizational decisions or implement organizational decisions that either go against our own values or that we know will lead to the suffering or cause moral distress for the people that we lead. And again, that example of feeling numb or nothing, that internal reaction of this isn't who I am, this isn't how I should be reacting, can be very morally distressing. So that's a kind of a limited set of examples, and hopefully they're broad enough that you can apply them to your own workplace, your own setting, your own situation. But we are for sure seeing this in all sorts of work, not just limited to healthcare, and in all parts of, in many parts of the globe. I'm giving some specific examples. Hopefully, if you're here to think about this, how this applies to your own situation or people you're working with, hopefully these are broadly applicable enough. So what are some of the consequences of moral distress and moral injury? Literature that started with a lot of healthcare nurses in particular, that's since broadened out more on moral distress. Those studies often look at people who are still in that work site, who are feeling morally distressed, and also look at, what else is going on around that. So some of the correlates of moral distress, if people are feeling moral distress in the workplace, they're also often feeling more of a sense of anger or disgust or even grief. They might be feeling burnout on their job. And burnout, we know, comes with a lot of things like feeling numb, like not having the usual empathy, like just not caring as much. We see changes in sleep and behavior. So maybe these aren't at quite a diagnosable level, although maybe they are, but we could see people just sleeping more restlessly or not sleeping as much. They might be kind of going to their coping methods, which whether those are, healthy coping or not. So that might be more isolation, more avoidance for some, more compulsive behaviors, more substance use sometimes. Again, the loss of compassion or empathy. And sometimes we see feelings of guilt and shame. And again, these are often situations where the person either doesn't have a lot of control to really change things, or there's no good outcome. Like if I just did X, everything would be right. Because if you do X, then Y is off. And if you do Y, then X is off. And yet there's still this very common reaction of guilt and shame. And when I talk about guilt and shame, they're similar but not totally interchangeable in that guilt is more related to an event. I did something bad. I don't like how I handled that situation. I feel really guilty because I really feel like I messed that up, or, I went against my values. And shame is broader than I did something bad. It becomes I am bad. So it's not just feeling bad about a situation, but it's I am bad. And I'll tell you that in my work with moral injury, in our studies, when we recruit, we found that guilt has invariably turned into shame, and the people that really come to us for a pretty intensive level of treatment, where it's not just that they feel bad about an event, but they really feel sometimes unlovable or undeserving of good things because of what they're telling themselves about themselves that may be stemming from this morally injurious event. The good news is that when we talk about consequences of morally distressing situations, most people will not experience lasting distress. So most people will somehow either come to some peace with the situation, they'll realize they did the best they could in a very difficult situation. Time will do its magic and they'll just kind of move on and not focus on the event and its impact as much. Most people will be fine. And in our professions of mental health and research and medicine and helping, we do have kind of expectations that people will suffer, right, in our field of traumatic stress. So generally, that helps us kind of make sense of things, understanding that that is common, and especially in the populations we choose to work with. Our training and preparation, maybe our cultural norms can offer us some support and a way forward. Messaging and support from peers and leaders. We're all in an impossible situation. You did the best you could. I was there with you. Those can be helpful. Acceptance from family and community and culture at large can help someone find peace. And sometimes we can see positive growth of this was an awful situation, but it helped me realign with my values. It helped me realize that what really matters to me is X. It helped me realize that I do want to make a career change, or that I want to be this kind of boss and prioritize these kinds of things. So sometimes, while it doesn't reduce the initial negative impact or any negative impact, there could also be some positive growth that comes out of these kinds of situations that also helps us move forward in a positive way. So while most people will be fine, there's a small percentage that may go on to develop more severe moral injury, which has all those components of moral distress we discussed, but also really kind of measurable problems with functioning, perhaps at work or in relationships. It could come with changes in spirituality or religious practice. Sometimes in our work, we see people who say, now that I know God is capable of this, or how can I turn to God after I did Y? This can be very personal, what someone's religious or spiritual beliefs look like, but it can change as a result of moral injury. We could see self-sabotaging behaviors, which again might be part of that. I don't deserve to be happy. So people may sabotage themselves at work. They may purposely make mistakes. They may come in late. They may seem really ambivalent about whether they want to do a good job or not. And this may all come from this perception that they don't deserve to do well. So they sabotage themselves. There could be a deep sense of being damaged or flawed or unforgivable with moral injury. And I think we can conceptualize it as a very deep psychic or existential pain around stemming from this morally distressing experience. And we have quite a few studies now, really from many areas of the world, showing that moral injury can be associated with higher rates of depression, substance use, worse functioning, PTSD symptoms, and even suicidal thoughts and behaviors. That was really all to kind of set the stage of what is moral distress, what is moral injury. And now, again, returning to our focus of the workplace, we'll spend really the rest of the time kind of looking at strategies that we can use to help ourselves, our peers, and colleagues, and what we could do as leaders to help support everyone around us in morally distressing situations. I'll start with the hardest one, which is self-care. And it's, I think, particularly hard for those of us in helping professions and those of us in very high-level professions. We are often better at noting what others need than we are at doing that self-check and then giving ourselves what we need. I would say, especially in situations where work is causing moral distress, causing a lot of potentially angst and difficult situations, and a lot of decisions about what to do with no easy answers. And we're really feeling some of those consequences of that moral distress. That is a really good time to do that self-check. And it is a really good time to do some self-care, whatever that looks like for you. In part because, again, that moral distress is linked with burnout and lack of empathy and, trouble sleeping and things that impact our performance and impact our ability to support others. So we want to do these things for ourselves. We want to do these things for who matters for us outside of work. And we want to do these things for who and what matters for us at work. But, some of this does involve reaching out to others. which may not come easily again, but especially when we have to make difficult choices where there's no right answer, and any answer leads to violating some value and maybe causing some moral distress. Talking about it with trusted colleagues or leaders or some good sounding board can be really helpful to get the broader perspective, get to that level of acceptance of it's not that I'm missing the right choice. It's not that there's a right answer out there and I'm missing it, but it's that there is no right, easy answer here. And it's kind of validating for that sense of moral distress. So even being able to accept that this is just a really difficult situation with no easy answer can be really helpful to managing the moral distress. Another thing we could do, which many of us are quite expert in our clinical work, is monitoring that internal self-talk. In what worked in easier times may not work in a very morally distressing situation. So our normal expectations of ourselves may need to change, and we may not do that unless we kind of examine the situation and, really reflect on it. So sometimes we need to modify our expectations to meet the current reality. So maybe there's things I'm doing in my job now that I couldn't have imagined 6 months ago, but that's my current reality, and that's what I need to base my decision making on and my expectations on, right? And then, of course, as we know, the should thoughts are never helpful, right? Um, so that I should have done better. I should have been more comforting to my team. I should have helped them more with the situation. I should have just said no and said, I don't believe in this, and walked out. Maybe that's helpful for next time, but the should kind of judgments just keep us in a self-punishing negative space, right? Instead of either I did the best I could, or I learned a valuable lesson that felt really awful, so next time I'm going to try a different response. But there's no easy response here, so it makes sense that I didn't nail it the first time, and that now I have to look at the situation and think about how I'll handle it differently next time. And next time, it probably won't feel great either, because there's no easy answer here. So other things that, again, many of us are very well versed at helping others with, but sometimes it's good to have a moment to think about how we can apply these to ourselves. Focusing on the things we can control, finding satisfaction in small actions or accomplishments. Sometimes when I'm feeling very out of control, I think, is there one nice thing I could do for someone today? Is there one kindness I could put out into the world? And kind of spend a couple of minutes in that space. Some people, it's helpful to lean into their religious faith or spirituality, and in general, kind of just acknowledging that these are not usual times, these are not usual situations, that we need to be more patient and more kind with ourselves and with the people around us. There's endless tools out there, as we all know, because we all have phones and computers and the internet. These are some that are put out by National Center for PTSD that are free, apps that can be downloaded that have a variety of self-help kind of tools built in, whether it's relaxation or self-talk or suggestions for things to do. There's the mindfulness coach, which obviously focuses on the specific skill of mindfulness. PTSD coach, it's helpful coping tools for people with PTSD, but also I think for anyone under stress. Same with COVID coach. COVID coach is about to change its name to something more general, because there's really nothing about it that makes it only for COVID, but that's when it was developed. But it's really for managing difficult situations and unusual stress. So really could be quite relevant for someone going through kind of workplace related moral distress. And the name will be changed in the next few months, but it should still be findable as COVID coach as well. And a coach for people having trouble sleeping. So those are some self-help ideas. In terms of supporting our colleagues and peers, broadly, reaching out is always a good idea. Listening, helping someone broaden their perspective, but also keeping in mind that if we're all kind of in this together, We all might have different limits and harder days, and it's okay to set our own limits and keep our own boundaries for our own well-being as well. So to break these down a little bit more, sometimes when we're going through similar things in a workplace, we can kind of have a better understanding of what someone's going through than maybe when you go home and try to explain it to your family or your support network outside of work. Both can be really helpful, right? Both the peers who get it, who are there also experiencing the same thing, and also the person who cares about you who's a little bit more removed. But certainly there's room to support colleagues and peers because we know what they're going through. We can maybe see the signs of how it's impacting them in the setting more than others. We know what's been happening. We may have natural empathy because we're like, I feel it too, right? And we may have credibility as someone who's been there that someone who's more removed and wants to give helpful advice may not have. I've seen this so many times in my clinical work in a group where peers can say things to each other like, oh, I was in a similar battle and, you can't possibly have known XYZ. And that person who shared their story is receptive to that message. Where if I as a therapist said that, they'd be like, well, you weren't there, you don't get it. So there is this kind of credibility that comes from peers potentially where we can support our peers in a unique way. So when I say reaching out to peers, of course, we want to respect their boundaries, respect our own boundaries. But if someone is giving off signs that they want to talk and we have the capacity to be a good listener and be there for them at that time, then should be our focus, to be a good listener. Some of the kinds of things that can help open a conversation. It sounds like you've experienced some things that nobody should experience. Can you help me understand how it's impacting you? It sounds like you're sad because of something you didn't do. It sounds like you feel very, very burdened by things you did or didn't do. This must be so hard. I don't know if I can hear the story, but can I connect you with someone who can, if it's too much for you? So I know that many of the people attending this is like listening 101 that you learned many, many years ago, but I always find it helpful when I want to apply these things in a way that I don't always, or more mindfully, to kind of have that reminder. So hopefully this is helpful too, of just how we maybe open up a conversation with colleagues in a way that we may not normally in easier or more normal times. Another thing we could do is, again, help them get that broader perspective. They might be hyper-focused on their own part of something, missing that they're in this bigger organizational structure where they had very few choices or no good choices. They might be hyper-focused on their own piece of it. They may be telling themselves they should have been able to prevent a bad outcome, which may not have been possible, that they're really focused on their own role in the bad outcome, not kind of realizing the bigger picture, not realizing what they could or couldn't control. Again, there's that opportunity possibly sometimes for positive growth. So maybe part of the conversation is around, what is the meaning of this to you? Why does this feel so bad? What does this mean about what matters to you? And similarly, your values must be so important to you if you suffer so much when they're violated. What are things that you're doing that feel good in terms of your values, or what can you be doing? So again, the boundaries of your relationships and your setting and your roles, but these are possible ways that we can reach out to colleagues and possible ways that we can help them broaden their perspective. And of course, one of the challenges, on the one hand, when we're all going through something similar or having the same crazy stuff coming at us from above that we have to figure out how to cope with, on the one hand, it's nice to have that community and that shared experience, to have people who understand that can be helpful. On the other hand, we could kind of assume that others are reacting how we are, or that it's affecting them similarly, or that they don't understand at all because they're reacting differently. I'm crying and this person is kind of staring blankly, so they don't care, even though they're just responding in a different way. And some of these things, are very snap kind of not on the surface kind of thoughts or judgments we make. So if we are trying purposefully, mindfully, to be supportive of our colleagues, to be supportive of our peers, to be helpful. Then also kind of taking that accepting, non-judgmental, empathic stance, taking the time to sort of say, I'm reacting like this, but others will react in a whole host of ways. And it doesn't mean I'm taking this more seriously or it hurts me more, or they're taking it more seriously or it hurts them more. So we want to kind of, if we're really wanting to support our colleagues, stay open and alert to what's the hard thing about this for them today. It may not be the same thing that's hard for me about this today. What are my own values here on perpetration and morals and values and spirituality? And is this person in some way self-sabotaging? And, are they making things kind of harder on themselves in a way that maybe they're not seeing? Patricia Watson did a companion talk to this talk where she really talks about using kind of tools for managing stress in the workplace. And there are stress first aid toolkits and skills for psychological recovery that are really applicable for workplaces, for healthcare workers, and for other people experiencing moral distress or more just stress in the workplace that can also be really helpful. And these are free and downloadable from the National Center for PTSD, as well as other places. So in terms of the roles of leaders, there can be many ways to be a leader, right? It could be an informal leadership. It could be, I have a study and I have a team that runs the study. It could be, I am the CEO of a company, or I lead a large lab, or I'm the director of a clinic. So when I say leaders here, I mean very broadly, whether we're mentoring a couple of people or leading a large number of people in a more formal organizational chart kind of capacity. But leaders do have a unique ability to be helpful in kind of helping people with the distress of morally difficult situations, especially if the people that they are leading respect them and respect their experiences and opinions. They then have a lot of credibility and can bring a lot of comfort. Leaders also have a strong role in setting ground rules and communicating organization values and standards. And I've certainly seen this in organizations where maybe things are coming from a very, very high level that can feel very wrong, but at a more immediate level, you could say, okay, we're all on the same page here, on the same page enough. We share a mission, we share a vision, we want to do things a certain way or believe in certain things. And that can be really helpful, even if several layers above that, the messaging is very opposed to your values. So some of the things that leaders can do is kind of just communication and transparency can be really key. When people are just told now we do things this way, or they don't understand kind of that what's changing. Do they just know that, decisions are being made they don't agree with? That's more morally distressing and difficult than a situation where a leader is communicating changing policies, communicating decisions to the extent possible, communicating the thinking behind them. Leaders can also help kind of normalize morally distressing and difficult situations if they're common and happening all around, so they can send the message that moral distress can occur. They can offer brief check-ins and debriefs after particularly difficult situations, have town halls or have team meetings. They can offer praise for, that was a tough situation. There was no easy answer. I saw you struggle with it. I saw you do your best. And they can normalize that this is unusual times and we're going through something very difficult together. And, reminding people that they're doing their best under difficult circumstances, and that you won't always do your best under difficult circumstances, that, part of it being in difficult circumstances means that there's not easy answers, that we'll make more mistakes, that we'll have some regrets, that we'll want to do things differently next time, that we'll wish there were more options. So having kind of all that normalized and appreciated, especially from a supportive leader, can really help people navigate these morally distressing situations and hopefully prevent some really long-lasting negative outcomes. And another thing that leaders can do is destigmatize help seeking, right? So especially if it is a situation where some people might benefit from seeking support, from going to their EOP or going to see a therapist or whatever it might be, to kind of in some capacity normalize that, whether it's a little self-disclosure or whatever is appropriate for that work site, can be very helpful. And certainly leaders as well as peers, we can be, if we're concerned about others, we could be looking for other symptoms. Are there things that, the person's not acting like their normal selves, then it's not just an off day or an off week. They're really like long-term, we're seeing changes in mood, anxiety, avoidance, or self-harm behaviors, change in self-care, alcohol or drugs, reckless behavior, self-handicapping behaviors like retreating from success or undermining others' efforts to help them, or if someone's feeling really demoralized, futile, hopeless, self-loathing. We're not out there to all be screening and diagnosing each other. That's generally not appropriate and not what we should be doing. But if we do notice that someone's really struggling, it's worth taking note of that. And certainly, we can say, hey, do you want to talk? Do you need some extra support? Again, that destigmatizing of getting help, that setting, being the role model can be really helpful. And again, some people will develop longer lasting moral injury where it might be helpful to, really get a recovery oriented kind of treatment. We've done some work with those who also have PTSD, generally so far with veterans. And, this is a talk on how to address both moral injury with PTSD among people who have both, through prolonged exposure therapy or cognitive processing therapy, two of our effective treatments. We also have moral injury that it can be helped. So our intervention is 6 sessions with 3 modules. The first one focused on psychoeducation about guilt and moral injury and how it happens after morally distressing events. The second is really kind of a debrief or a processing of what happened, what was the event, often a traumatic event, but not always. What was what was the person saying to themselves about what they should have done and what they should have known, and how, why they're at fault and things like that. And then a reconnection with values in terms of we can't change the past, but look at how you suffer when your values have been violated. What are values that are important to you? How do we put those more into your life going forward? With the idea that people are suffering with moral injury in part as a way to express a value. I really messed up and now I deserve to suffer. So can we instead fill their life with more positive ways of expressing values, more joyful ways, more with the idea that then maybe those positive ways can take more room in the way they express values, and the negative ways, the suffering, the self-sabotage, can shrink. In our first trial of the intervention, we randomized 145 veterans to either trigger our intervention or supportive therapy, where the client could talk about whatever was bothering them in the moment and get kind of a supportive Rogerian intervention and response. And all the people in the study endorsed trauma-related guilt from an event from a military deployment. And we didn't require a PTSD diagnosis, but 85% of people turned out to have PTSD. And we did a baseline assessment, and then at the end of the 6-week intervention, and then 3 months later and 6 months later, and we found that trauma-related guilt was significantly lower at all the time points after the intervention. We didn't at that time have a change measure for moral injury. We do now, and we're using that in our current study. And we saw lower PTSD symptoms and depression symptoms for those who got trigger versus the supportive care therapy. And we saw among those who had PTSD a much higher response to treatment, much higher loss of diagnosis. Half the people lost their PTSD diagnosis, double the rate of PTSD remission. And among those with clinically meaningful depression, we saw much more change. So I share that really in the spirit of just hope that even those who are most impacted and really experiencing a very high level of distress and impairment, that they can feel better from moral distress and moral injury. So just to finish up, the kind of big bullets to round this out. Most people who experience moral distress will not have lasting impacts, lasting, impairing distress. And there are strategies that we can use to help ourselves, our peers and colleagues, the people we lead, to make the chance of not having that lasting distress even greater. And that, we can all lean on the support of our communities and offer support to our communities. And certainly, I will say that's true for ISTSS for me, where the outreach of my colleagues and the support of my colleagues in difficult times is critical. And hopefully I return that as well. So in that spirit, I want to say thank you to each of you. Thank you for listening. Feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. I also wanted to thank Dr. Patricia Watson, because a lot of this is based on her writing and her work, and all my many colleagues who offer support through all these times. So thank you all.